Install and configure servers. In this nugget, we're going to be taking a look at several items related to installing and configuring servers, starting with the planning phase, which is all important because the better you plan, the fewer snags you're going to run into, hopefully, as you go throughout the process. We'll take a look at the installation itself, some of the roles, as well as the upgrade. And this is actually very easy. You can only upgrade from Windows Server 2008 or Windows Server 2008 R2, and it has to be 64-bit versions because Server 2012 is only available in a 64-bit. Also, we'll take a look here at Server Core. How do you install Server Core? It's really very simple. It's almost exactly the same as installing it with a UI. So there's not really a whole lot to that one. There's also something called Features on Demand, which we'll discuss briefly but demonstrate in an upcoming nugget. And we'll also talk about migrating roles. And this is very useful, for example, if you have maybe an older Server 2003 server with a specific role or feature on it, and you want to migrate that over to a 2012 server because you were not able to upgrade that 2003 machine. Have you ever done something that you wish you could undo or do differently? That's how it is whenever I'm in a heated discussion with somebody. Anytime that happens, I never think of what I should have said at the moment. I always think of it after the conversation. I say, why didn't I say it this way? Or why didn't I think of this? I got into a difficult situation like that recently when I was at dinner with my family and a house guest that we had over. And my wife was asking why I wasn't eating too much of her delicious entree. And I was trying to say, well, one of us is going to have to lose some weight, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be me. But instead I said, one of us is going to have to lose some weight. And then an awkward pause. And I was trying to move my mouth, and it was moving up and down, but no words were coming out. I started getting glares from other people at the table. And I had dish duty that night. Plus, I ate the leftovers of that meal for the next 2 days. Anyway, what I want to say with that is, sometimes you want to go back and undo something that you've done in the past. Certainly, however, if you plan in advance, and if you have the luxury of doing that, it's going to make your whole experience better. Alright, so let's take a look here at planning properly for the installation and roles. Now, one thing I want to say at the outset before we look at this material is that we're not talking about big strategies here. We're not talking about connecting multiple sites globally and setting up your site links, setting up your replication schedules, anything elaborate in that sense, or clustering, failover. Most of that kind of stuff is going to be for the higher numbered exams as you go out through the MCSE process here. But for this, we're mostly thinking of smaller rollouts. We're not thinking of imaging or big images or large-scale rollouts, things like that. Smaller kind of individual rollouts is the thing we're looking at mostly. One thing I would recommend, though, is that you practice the deployment in virtual machines whenever possible. You may have some physical machines that you can migrate to virtual machines. A lot of products such as VMware and Hyper-V have some, and some third-party products have some things that you can do to take a physical machine, migrate it into a virtual machine. There's also various backup software that can do that for you. Then once you've got it into that virtual machine, test it out. Try to do an upgrade if it'll accept one. If it does do the upgrade, then you can go ahead and test your software, for example, and see if the software is still working, if it has any bugs or anything that will be affected by that upgrade. Also, you want to get accustomed to the UI. There's a lot of things that are new here. You can have start charms, for example. You're going to shut down differently. You're going to log off differently. It's all weird right at the beginning. And I'm going to take you through the UI a little bit later on, probably in the next nugget, so you can get accustomed to that. Also, prepare the hardware. I do recommend that you get the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. It's currently in version 7.0, and it's useful for identifying whether or not your desktops are upgradable to Windows 8 and your servers are upgradable to Windows Server 2012. An excellent toolkit. I wasn't really going to show it because it's not part of the exam. However, I did go ahead and download it. It took me about an hour to get a lot of this stuff ready because there were some prerequisites I had to meet and so forth. Let me move this in here. It's actually in a remote desktop session. But one of the first things you'll do is you perform an inventory. I've only got a couple machines on the network right now, so it didn't really do a lot there. I just wanted to show you the basics of how this will look. You can see here that it will give you summaries of the machines that you've taken a look at, whether or not you're ready for Windows 8 or Windows 7, and you can see some of the other options here as well. Also, it tells you whether or not you could virtualize some of your roles. There's a lot of things here that would be very useful. One of the big things right now is to consolidate physical servers into higher density virtual machines. And you're probably aware of virtualization, but in case you're not, it's where you can take a single physical machine that has an operating system on it, such as Windows Server 2012, and then you can use something like Hyper-V or a VMware product to install multiple other operating systems inside of that physical hardware. So you can basically get the density of dozens, sometimes even hundreds of operating systems on a single set of hardware. Virtualization is touched on in probably every exam that Microsoft has right now on Windows Server 2012. Anyway, I'm not going to elaborate on all of this. There's a lot of different options, a lot of things to look at. But went ahead and did a collection, and I had a Windows Server 2003 computer on the network. We see that the system requirements are not met there because I haven't even looked at the results yet. But there is a folder where all the results are recorded, and if I double-click on this to open it up, it can open up in WordPad or Microsoft Word if I have it installed, and that gives me all of the different results, whether or not it was compatible, what the problem might have been. I haven't even looked at any of these. Let me go ahead and click on one of these, and let's just go to page 4, see what it told me. So let's see. Down here, the readiness results, it says that system requirements were met. No. System requirements not met. Okay, thank you. And it just tells you, some of the things that were possibly wrong with that. I haven't even gotten into it, so not sure the reason why it wasn't compatible right now, other than the fact that you can't upgrade to from Windows Server 2003 to 2012. You would have to do a leapfrog upgrade where you go to 2008 first and then 2012, or you would have to use other migration scenarios, which I'll talk about here as well in this nugget. And then scrolling further on down here, this is the thing that's really handy. It tells you specific next steps you need to do to deploy Windows Server 2012, and it gives you, I scrolled too far here, it gives you all of the specific instructions right here. So anyway, don't need to elaborate too much more on that. Again, it's not directly part of the exam, but I strongly recommend that you look for and download that particular piece of software. Very useful. Also, when it comes to the minimum requirements for Windows Server 2012, I was kind of surprised they're surprisingly light. And the reason for that is likely because you can install Windows Server Core. Now, we had that in 2008. We still have it in 2012. And in addition to Core, you can kind of strip off additional features to make it an even lighter footprint. Let's take a look at the minimum system requirements that we see here. This is a document that's available for you up on nuggetlab.com, and it's the Windows Server 2012. I'll show you the PDF name. Installation requirements.pdf. It's part of a zip file that'll be available for you up there for this topic. Now anyway, here's the requirements. You can see it only requires a single processor, but most servers nowadays are at least dual core, if not quad core or more. Also, notice that it's only 64-bit. Everything out there now is 64-bit. Nobody's making 32 bits really anymore for server or desktop operating systems. This will be a factor if you have a 32-bit, let's say, Windows Server 2008 installation, and you want to perform an upgrade. Well, you can't, because there's no upgrade from 32-bit to 64-bit, so you'd have to come up with another plan there. Again, we'll talk about some of the ways to migrate there as we go. Also, only 512 megabytes of RAM. Now, of course, that's very dependent on what you need to run on it. If it's a pretty thin core installation that only has a very small, simple service that it's running, something like that, probably would be just fine. You really don't need much more than that. And again, here only 32 gigabytes of hard drive space, although everything is gigantic now and terabytes of size and so on. There's also some other things down here which I won't elaborate on too much. They pretty well explain themselves if you read the document. One thing that I do want to point out, though, is the kernel, digitally signed kernel mode drivers. This has been a big push for years now for Microsoft. What happens is if a driver has been tested and confirmed to be stable, Microsoft will allow a digital signature on it, and that kind of is its seal of approval or stamp of approval for that driver. If you don't have signed drivers, you might still have to have them. Maybe it's a mass storage device that you have to have and there's no way around it. Here's some instructions on how to install it, even though it's not a signed driver, but out of the box, you cannot install an unsigned driver unless you kind of trick it into doing this, as you see here. It's also a good time for upgrades. It's not directly a part of the exam, but a lot of organizations, as they do their map toolkit analysis, they'll realize that some of their hardware is lagging, so they'll do their hardware upgrades. That's what I'm really talking about there, is hardware upgrades. And then if you do have any drivers that you need to install, you can do that during the installation process. There will be an option, and you'll see this as we demo an installation here shortly, that you can specify mass storage devices that you need. However, again, it's better if they're signed. If they're unsigned, though, you need to follow the instructions at the bottom of that minimum requirements document that I just showed you. Now, I do also recommend that you pre-learn certain PowerShell commandlets that you might need. This is for both practical purposes as well as the exam purposes. Now, you do not need to be a black belt in PowerShell. Okay, for the black belt, you don't need to be one. You can be a white belt, maybe a yellow belt, something like that. In case you don't know what PowerShell is, though, let me just give you an example here. Let me go over here. This is a Windows Server 2012 machine that I've got elsewhere, and I'm connected through a remote desktop here. So let me drag it over into the window area. And you can see that there's a PowerShell item down here at the bottom. If you click on that, it opens up a Windows PowerShell prompt, or really this is a console. Now, what kind of things could I do here? Well, I could do get. This is just an example of how you can use this event log. And if I don't specify, it's going to ask me what event log I want. So I'm going to type system, for example. And I could even say I only want the last 10 items that appear in the system log. Well, see, now I've used PowerShell to be able to get this information for myself. There's several different aspects to PowerShell. Unless you're a black belt like John Jones in PowerShell, he does our PowerShell training for CBT Nuggets, then you're not going to have memorized a lot of these different things. You may have to go online to look at some of the PowerShell commands that you'll need and so forth. And again, for purposes of this course, I'll tell you the PowerShell commandlets that will be important. Also, each one of the PowerShell commandlets, actually let me go back to that, has a great deal of parameters that you might be able to use. So if I do a help get event log, then this is asking me if I want to update my help system. I'm just going to choose no for right now. But you can see there's all different kinds of syntax parameters that you can put into this thing. No way in the world am I going to memorize all of that stuff. That's what help is for. So if you need help with one of these items, just type help first, and then whatever the PowerShell command is that you're interested in. Okay, it's going to help you go a long ways as a rookie in PowerShell. Also, do watch out for any removed or deprecated items within Windows Server 2012. There might be a service, such as for example, there's changes in federation services. There's changes in clustering that are not exactly the same as they were in Windows Server 2008. You may have third-party products that work alongside of those types of services or features, and they may not work with Windows Server 2012. So you might need to be aware of that in advance. For example, here's a web page on TechNet, and you can see the URL up here, but if you want the bit.ly item, we actually have a CBT kind of shortcut for that. This is case sensitive, by the way. I don't know why they had to make it that way, but that's what it is. Anyway, so you can see here that you can just go to cbt.gg and then the rest of that at the end. That would take you to the same place here. So if there's changes to federation services that you might need to know about, clustering, there's some graphics, Hyper-V changes, go through all of that. This is not specifically exam-worthy that you have to know about each one of these items, but for your own practical purposes, you might need to know about some of these items. Also, this is so important. Back your systems up. Now, I'm probably preaching to the choir there because I'm sure you already have some kind of a backup system in place. But it's amazing how many organizations of surprising size don't have or have holes in their backup plans. Or they have a server that they've added that they, never remembered to add to a backup plan. So make sure you have a backup of it, especially of any machines that you want to upgrade, so that you have a backup plan so that if something goes bad, you can restore. Also, don't just back up. Periodically test the restores. This is kind of a rudimentary rule for anybody that's a backup administrator. Every now and then you test your restore to make sure that there's nothing wrong with that process. Otherwise, you have a useless backup. And then have a contingency plan. So, for example, if you're upgrading a DNS server, and just in case the backup and restore process were to fail catastrophically for some reason, or the tape drive that you backed it up to started smoking and caught on fire, something like that, make a contingency plan such as having some other DNS server that you could immediately bring online to take the place of the first one, for example. So that's just an example. Also, you'll want to be sure to roll out in stages. You don't want to do all of this at once. And that's, again, for people with experience in rollouts, this is a common practice. This is also just a short list. There's lots of other things you could add on to this. Even the rolling out in stages could be an entire white paper on its own, because you may have a pilot program first and various other kinds of tests that you do before you even do the rollout. And then there's a certain logic to how you do the rollouts. You might start with the least significant department or the smallest office so that you have the least impact in case something were to go wrong. Now, there's several different levels of installation that you can look at here for Windows Server 2012. The first one here is just that a full GUI, or graphical user interface, and there's no surprises there. It'll have Windows Explorer, Internet Explorer, control panel, a start menu, or at least now they call it a charm. There's all different kinds of things to see and click on. Fancy little checkboxes, that kind of thing. But the way that Microsoft is really trying to push us is to the new default, which is using Windows Server 2012 in the core installation. Now, we started with this in 2008, and the main idea of this is that you don't really usually use the console to log on locally to most servers, especially in the enterprise, where there's hundreds or thousands of servers there. Very often, nobody even touches those servers unless they do a hardware swap or something like that. Most of the administration is done from some administrator's cubicle, not even in the server room. And we just use Windows 7, Vista, or Windows 8 or something like that to remotely administer all of these machines. And in that respect, it doesn't even matter if it has a full UI on it or not. So Core is going to give us some advantages there, including the fact that it's a minimal attack surface. Because there's less of the operating system, there are much fewer exploits to execute on that operating system. A lot of the exploits that have come out in recent years actually have something to do with the UI. It's just some kind of a vulnerability that hackers are able to worm their way through, some vulnerability in the UI, and without a UI, it really minimizes that surface. Also, it's a small footprint. Very little disk space is needed for a Core installation, so you can conserve on that. Also, it's highly reliable. Again, because there's no UI, we're able to just dramatically increase the reliability of the operating system, because Microsoft has estimated in the past that around 90% of their updates had something to do with the graphical user interface. So if we take away that as a potential weakness, then we're much more reliable. Also, it's very easily managed, as I mentioned before. You can use a couple of different tools. We'll discuss these later on as well. WinRS and WinRM, which are kind of two sides of the same coin. Those are what allow you to remotely administer a remote machine, one of the tools that you can use there. Also, you can use PowerShell to remotely administer other machines. You can use Server Manager from, for example, a Windows 7 or a Windows 8 computer that has the remote server administration tools installed. And that's actually what that is, remote server administration tools. So a number of different methods. There's also third-party products and other things you can do. System Center Configuration Manager. Lots of ways of remotely administering those Core installations. Now, for purposes of being able to train and to show you things, most of the things that I'll be doing will be on the full graphical user interface. But in most productions, you'll see most of the time Core, at least hopefully. Also, there's something called Features on Demand and Minimal Server Interface. We'll be talking about those probably in the next nugget, because I don't really have time to demonstrate those here, but we will in the next nugget. This is what's going to do is it's going to reduce the footprint of the operating system. It's going to reduce either the full GUI installation that you've got, or it could also reduce a Core installation. And what it does is it removes the payload or the bits of any unused items. So if you've never used DNS and you don't plan to use DNS on the particular installation of Windows that you've got, why even have the bits there? There's actually bits that could still be exploited as a vulnerability, even if they're compressed or they're contained in other files and so on. It could still be exploited. First of all, so you want to increase the security by removing those items, and you can remove, again, the disk space, and this is very useful in an imaging sense as you get more advanced into Windows deployments, because you can use a very thin image to deploy it across multiple destinations. Also, you could use the minimal server interface, which is kind of a compromise. A lot of people are kind of afraid of Core because we're used to the start menu. We're used to all of the graphics and everything. But when we went to Core, because, hey, that's what everybody else was doing, and we decided to drink the Kool-Aid, we're kind of lost. I mean, there's just a command prompt window there. Gee, what do you click on? Well, the minimal server interface is kind of a compromise between these two, and that gives you a GUI, but it doesn't give you Internet Explorer. It doesn't give you all of the control panel parts, just a subset of them, and so on. So we'll talk about that in more detail later on, but it kind of is a transition between full and Core. Alright, now what I've got here is I'm actually using VMware Workstation, and you can kind of see up there at the top that I'm working with VMware. This is what I call my bare metal image. This is what I always use to just start an installation with. You don't need to know that for exam purposes or anything, just my own method. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just power on this machine where I have it connected to an ISO of the Windows Server 2012 bits. All we're really doing here is we're just looking at how the installation goes, and I kind of have to keep resizing things here because the window size keeps changing as it performs this installation. Anyway, we see Windows getting started up here, and everything's looking okay. It just boots from that CD, and then here in a moment we'll have a UI to work with. It's just a basic UI that you'll have. You'll see this whether you're going to install Core or whether you're going to install the full graphical user interface. And then we can just choose your language and keyboard input, all that kind of stuff. You'll find that this installation of Windows Server 2012 as well as the upcoming Windows Server 8, is very easy. There are much fewer steps than we ever used to have. I remember, I think it was Windows 98 or something like that, used to have all kinds of marketing lingo and graphics and everything over to the side telling you what a wonderful decision you'd made to install that version of Windows, and it told you all the hot new features that were there and stuff. Anyway, so all we do now is really just install now. Of course, there's a repair your computer item down there which explains itself, but since we don't have an operating system here installed yet, there's nothing to repair. So we'll go ahead and get that launched. And then we see we get the option here to select which version of Windows we want to install. As I mentioned before, Core is the default, but I'm going to choose a graphical user interface here. And again, notice that it's only 64-bit for this as well. Also, there's another version of Windows. I'll just give you a quick side note here. It's called Windows Server 2012 Essentials. That is kind of the equivalent to what we used to call Small Business Server. That does have a 32-bit version available. For our purposes in our current exam, that's not even a discussion, so we're not going to regard that 32-bit installation. Of course, there's the licensing agreement. You always got to agree to that, otherwise it stops. I could choose to do an upgrade. At this point, it would say, hey, we don't see an operating system here, so what's going on? If I were to click on that, because there is no operating system yet. Instead, I'm going to do a custom install. I think it would be better if they would have chosen to say clean install here, because most of the time that's really what it is. Then you can choose the drive space you want to install this on. If I had a mass storage driver and I was using that to expose my storage and I needed to load a driver for it, I would click that right here. I'm not going to do that right now, of course, because I don't really need to. I'm just going to install it on this drive. Now also, if you had to delete an existing partition or if you wanted to format that partition or otherwise manage it, then you can use these other options that explain themselves pretty well right here. Then I'll go ahead and click on Next, and we'll see that the installation kind of kicks off. There's not much else for you to do at this point. It'll just install all the features and everything. It'll reboot itself, and then you'll have a new operating system. And when it's there, I'll come back and take a look at it. Alright, and then the operating system seems to have loaded here. The first thing you'll see when it boots into the UI is that it's asking for the password for the administrator account, which is the first account that's created on the computer, and this is true of both Windows Server and client Windows operating systems, and it has full control over that local computer. So it's a very important account, and you need to protect it with a good password. So 7 characters or more. You also need to have upper lowercase, alphanumeric, and or special characters. You need to have 3 of the 4 requirements that I just mentioned there. So I'm just going to enter something in here. And they, of course, both have to match. That's the purpose of that, is to make sure that you don't slip that up. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Finish down here, kind of running out of room in terms of my screen size. Let me expand this up a little bit. Maybe that'll help. And then we have our operating system installed. Next, of course, I can then log in with that password that I just typed in and confirmed, and then it will give me a desktop. Now, this is a little bit different than Windows 8, which you may also be toying around with here, because with Windows 8, you see the tiles and all of that in the first screen, which is a little bit of a, or actually quite a paradigm shift compared to previous versions of Windows that we've worked with. Here in this Windows Server 2012, it actually does deliver to you a desktop, so it's a little bit more like what we've seen in previous versions of Windows. And you'll see that it's also loading Server Manager by default here, and that's where what you can use to get started in the configuration of the system. I'm not going to elaborate that too much right now because we will address that a little bit later. But as you can see, that's what it looks like. Again, a little bit different if you're used to previous versions of Windows. Now, it's not my objective here to completely go through all UI items for you, but in order to get accustomed to what we have to do moving forward, you have to know at least a few things. For example, where in the world is the Start menu? Normally, click on Start, and then you go search for whatever program that it is you want on the Start menu. Now, I don't have that. So if I go down here and click, what's this thing? Oh, that's Server Manager. So that's no help. Let me minimize that. Notice what happens here. If I go over to the lower left here, and it's really just like 4 pixels or something that you have to hover your mouse pointer over. There it is. Now, Start appears. Now, don't try to move up to it and then click on it, because you'll lose it. Just kind of hover over it, and then click there without moving the mouse. There's very few pixels down there in that lower left that you can work with there to reveal the Start menu. Notice that you can now go to Computer, Server Manager. A lot of the other things you would have been accustomed to seeing, now at least it's exposed to you, and you can access those items. Also notice that if I wanted to, let me go back to the desktop, if I wanted to log off, well, wait a minute, there's no Start menu, so you can't click Start and log off. Or actually, can you? This is called a Start charm now. It's a charm, so you click on that. And then you go up here to whoever's logged on. Now I can lock out, or excuse me, sign out. Okay, or you could lock the computer, either way. The other thing is, how do I shut this whole thing down? What if I wanted to restart the computer, shut down the computer, or something like that? Well, you go over to the right-hand side for that. You can go to the upper right over here, for example, and notice that it exposes these little items right here. Or you could go over here to the lower right, and again, it also shows them to me here. Then I would just go to Settings. By the way, if I click on Start, it's the same Start that we just looked at a moment ago with the Start charm over in the lower left. But I could go to Settings, and now I can choose Power. And right now I'm in a remote desktop session, so it's only going to show me Disconnect. But if I were in a physical logon console, then it would show me Restart or shut down. So that would also be available there. Also, we have Control Panel and some other things here, server information if you wanted to click on that, for example. Pretty much looking at the system properties, as you can see here. So all of those things are available in those ways. That gives you a little bit of a start here on how to navigate through this. I find this to be a little bit of a paradigm shift for me. I'm not quite sure I'm used to it or that I even like it. And it's even worse with Windows 8 because by default, it starts you off in this view, okay? But that's what we have to deal with now, so we might as well get used to it, I guess. Now, one of the exam objectives calls for us to know how to migrate features to a Windows Server 2012 computer from some other computer. So these are the Windows Server migration tools. These are actually PowerShell commandlets. What you can do with this is to migrate from Windows Server 2003, either Service Pack 2 or R2. Or you can migrate from Windows Server 2008, either the full edition or the full edition running R2. Okay, or you could run Windows Server 2012 full or core as well. You could transfer from that also, and that might be the case if you have one 2012 computer that's running certain features, and you want to transfer them over to another 2012 computer to either consolidate the roles or decommission the first server, something like that. Also, do notice here that you cannot transfer from Windows Server 2008 Core Edition. That is non-R2 edition. Why? Because it doesn't have the .NET framework, which is necessary for all of this. Okay, so that's just one thing to make note of. You can also transfer from physical to virtual. So if you have a physical box, the server's installed there. Let's say it's Windows Server 2008, and it's running a specific role, such as, I don't know, network access protection or something like that, which is a way of protecting your network from computers that are likely to be infected with malware of some type because they haven't gotten the latest updates. Well, if we had gone through all kinds of configuration and effort to configure that, we don't want to build a new Windows Server 2012 server and recreate all of those rules and everything from scratch. Maybe we want to put it into a virtual machine on Windows Server 2012. So this physical NAP machine, Network Access Protection server that's running Windows Server 2008, we can transfer all of the rules, all of the configuration and everything, maybe over to a virtual machine. Or if it's already in a virtual machine on 2008, we could transfer it to a physical 2012 machine. Or you can actually take this any direction. You can go P to P, V to V, you know, all of that. What I'm saying there is it doesn't matter whether it's physical or virtual. Also, you can only transfer to the same UI language. So if I've got a server that's installed in the Italian UI and I'm trying to transfer it over to the Japanese UI, not going to work. Can't do it that way. Also, I do have to be an administrator on both machines. They don't have to be part of the same domain or anything like that, but I do have to have administrative credentials to both the machines. Again, remember, these are really PowerShell scripts, and what you can do is to migrate a lot of different things here. You can migrate roles, you can migrate features, system settings, shares, data. A lot of this also depends upon documentation from Microsoft, and they haven't actually revealed all of the documentation necessary yet to transfer just about any role you would want. There's only a few out there so far, but I do expect more to be published as time goes by. Also, the ones that are even there right now are quite involved and complex. Not really that they're that hard. There's quite a lot of steps involved. Now, for purposes of the exam, you're not going to need to memorize all the steps for every single feature or role that you would want to transfer over. What you really need to know is the main method for setting it up so that both the source computer, like which has the original role or feature on it, and the destination computer, which will be your new Windows Server 2012 computer, you need to know how to set both of those up so that they're capable of transferring the roles or the features. Okay. Otherwise, you don't need to memorize every single detail. Alright, now in order to install the Windows Server Migration Tools, we can do this a few different ways, really, a couple different ways. We could go to where we are right now at the dashboard. Notice that Server Manager now starts in a dashboard view, and then we could click on Add Roles and Features. There's a number of different ways to get to that, by the way. We could click there. We could also click up here at Manage and choose Add Roles and Features, which is handy if we happen to be in some other part of the UI here where that's not easily exposed. We just click on Manage, Add Roles and Features, for example. Also notice that we can remove roles and features through the same UI. Add servers. We would do that to be able to centrally manage other servers from the same console. You can also create a server group, which allows you to do things such as make a single configuration change to the entire group at once, and then all servers will adopt that change. And then you can also go to the Server Manager properties, which is not that glamorous. Just tells you how often to refresh the screen or if it refreshes at all. Right now, by default, it does it every 10 minutes, which doesn't seem to be very refreshy, but you can adjust that if you want to. Also, you can go to some of the other common things that we were accustomed to seeing on the Start menu in the past that now appears under Tools. So if you think of administrative tools, that's pretty much what we've got here. Okay. So enough of that preamble. Let's go back to the dashboard, and I'm going to show you the fundamental way to add the server migration tools here. We just click on Next to get past the introduction. You want to install a role or feature-based item. Can't do remote desktop services installations because I'm not a member of a domain at this point, so that has to be a member of a domain in order to do that. And I want to select a server from the server pool, and right now I only have my own server in the server pool, so I'm going to use that one. Notice that you can also do a virtual hard disk. We'll come back to that at a later point in this series. That's very handy. Let's go ahead and click on Next. And then here we would go ahead and select what we want. Except for what we need is not on this particular screen, so we'll have to click on Next. And then down here towards the bottom, you'll see the Windows Server Migration Tools. There it is. Windows Server Migration Tools. That's what we want. And then we would click on Next, and then we would click on Install. Notice that you can also restart the destination server automatically if required. Okay, this is telling me that it's going to do that, and that's just a notification. Okay, so I could just click Install and allow that to happen. I'm going to cancel that so that I can also show you the PowerShell method for doing this. When you do using PowerShell, you need to right-click on the PowerShell icon down here and then choose Run as Administrator, okay, because it does require administrative privileges. Hopefully I remember the password. There it is. Okay. Now, from this point, what you'll need to do is to install Windows Feature, and then the migration is what you'll type in. So let's type in install, and then there's a hyphen, Windows Feature, okay, migration. Now, that's all I have to type here in PowerShell if I'm doing the installation on a local machine. I could also do this remotely and type computer name, and then type in the name of the computer here, Windows 1 or something like that, okay? I could do that, and then it will allow me to do that remotely, okay? Right now I'm just going to do this locally, so I'm pressing Enter, and that's really all there is to it. Once this is done, I'm going to have those tools installed. Also, while it's doing this, remember what I told you earlier. There are certain PowerShell commandlets that you'll need to know. Install Windows Feature, is kind of the generic beginning part of that, and then you have to specify which feature you want. We wanted the migration tools, so that's what we specified there. For purposes of the exam, you'll need to know the install-Windows feature command for sure. And then you would also need to know the migration part of that, and I'm trying to wait for the screen to reappear so I can show it to you again. You'd also want the migration part of that so that you would know how to install the migration tools. Alright, now it's finally finished installing, and again, this is the PowerShell command that we used for that. The first part of this is what you'll install anytime you install a Windows feature. You just have to specify which feature it is that you want to install. In this case, of course, it's migration. Here it's just telling me I don't have automatic updating turned on. I don't need a restart, and it exited successfully, so we're good with that. Now the next thing we would need to do is to actually go to a command prompt. So I'm going to go to the start charm here, and I'm just going to start typing CMD. Notice that when I do that, it automatically takes me to a search window, and then I can just click command prompt. Okay. Now that's not what I need to really do here though, and let me show you why. It needs to be an administrative command prompt. Well, geez, how do I do that then? Well, I'll click on start, CMD. Now I right click command prompt, and ooh, hey, look at this. Now I can choose run as administrator. And once I've done that, then it will allow me to open this up as an administrator of command prompt. The next thing we do is we need to run a utility called the server migration deployment executable. So it's I got to change to the correct directory, and that would be in CD, and then I think it's server migration tools. There it is. I'm using tab completion to fill the rest of that out because I'm too lazy to type. And then I do a dir, and we see there's the tool I'm looking for, smig deploy.exe. Okay, so I clear the screen here, and I'll type in what I would need to do to make this work. I'll type in smig deploy, and then package. What we're doing here is we're going to extract a package that has certain kinds of tools and other files that are necessary to make this tool operate. And I'm going to specify the architecture as well, whether it's x86 or x64. It's an x86, for example, in this case, because I'm trying to actually migrate things, or let's say that I want to migrate things from this Windows Server 2003 computer. Well, this is only a 32-bit operating system, so this would be a good reason why I'm doing a migration, because I cannot upgrade it because it's 32-bit. So what I would do here is I would specify the x86 as the architecture that I'm migrating from here, and then an OS would be WS. I seem to have lost my mouse. Okay, WS. Why isn't it taking any input? There it is. For some reason, it wouldn't take any input when I was typing here. But WS03/path, and then you can specify a local path on this local Windows Server 2012 server if you like, and then you can sneaker net it over to the other machine or network transfer, something like that. Or if you want to, you can directly UNC it. I think it's on this IP address. Hopefully I'm right. And it's in the migration folder there. It looks like it's doing just fine with that. So it's going to copy everything over to that Windows Server 2003 machine. Last time I did this, it took a little time. So I'm going to pause recording, and when this is done, we'll go over and take a look at it. Now over here on the Windows Server 2003 computer, you can see that I had a share that I copied all of that into using the command you saw me just execute, and there's all the goodies that are necessary to make all of that work. Now, you do have some prerequisites involved with this as well. I'm going to crack these open for you in a PDF file that's available for you on nuggetlab.com, and you can see all the different things that are required. Mostly it's the disk space. But for 2003 or 2003 R2, not only do you need the 25 megabytes disk space, but you need the .NET Framework 2.0, and according to this document, which is Microsoft's own TechNet document on the minimum requirements for this, they don't specify Service Pack 1. In my experience, you have to have it, and let me explain why. If you install just the .NET Framework 2.0, and then you try to install PowerShell 2.0, it won't take because it tells you you don't have .NET Framework 2.0 Service Pack 1. So then you have to cancel this installation, go back and install Service Pack 1, and then go back to installing PowerShell. You see the life I live, folks? I do all of this back and forth stuff just for your own benefit. But here, this link down here at the bottom will take you to the rest of the Microsoft documentation on that. And I do expect them to expand all of the available migrations that are going to be documented as time goes by here. Now, the next thing would have to happen in order to make this migration work is we would have to register the migration tools. And for this, we have to again open up an administrative command prompt. There's my old start menu, which I miss so much down there in Windows Server 2003. And go to a command prompt, and you have to have administrative privilege in the command prompt. If you're doing this from Windows Server 2008, you'll need to right-click on a Run As on the command prompt, and then choose to run as administrator. So here we are. We just need to change to the migration tools directory. Okay, like this. There it is. And there's all the tools that I mentioned to you earlier. I'm going to change directories to the SMT directory that we see here. And then I'm going to go ahead and complete this. To do that, all I have to do is to do a ./smig deploy and press enter. That's all I really have to do on the source computer. The old computer that you want to migrate the roles from, or the features, or whatever it is you're trying to move, that's going to be called the source computer, and the destination computer then would be the new Windows Server 2012 server. And then once you've done that, it'll return to you a PowerShell command prompt that you can use to start executing the PowerShell commandlets. Now, where you go from here is a broad range of different things you can do. Our objective here is to show you how to install these tools later on as Microsoft makes available the different migration scenarios that you can use. There's other things that you could do from this point forward. In this nugget, we took a look at planning your installation. We looked at the installation itself, which is actually very simple because remember, there's not a whole lot. If I can draw a straight line there, because there's not a whole lot to it. There's only a few steps involved. It's probably the simplest installation we've ever had. Also, we took a look at the various roles that you can work with in planning for those roles. Just got to make sure, first of all, that some of the roles haven't changed in the way they operate. We took a look at the upgrade process as well, but although that's really easy, you can only upgrade Windows Server 2008 or Server 2008 R2, and it has to be the 64-bit edition because Server 2012 is only a 64-bit. Also, we took a look at installing Server Core. Really not much different than installing the full graphical user interface. It's simply selecting Core at the beginning of the wizard. Also, we took a look at features on demand a little bit, and this is where we can remove the payload for certain things that we're not using. We're going to demonstrate that in an upcoming nugget, however. Also, we took a look at migrating roles. Remember, this can be very handy when you want to take a role or a feature or anything else that's configured on an older machine and you want to migrate that over to a newer Windows Server 2012 computer, particularly for machines that you cannot upgrade, such as a 32-bit Windows Server 2003 server. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.